The ink from the ballpoint pen bled into the cloth napkin faster than Maya Reeves expected, the white linen absorbing her warning like a confession whispered to a priest. Her hands remained steady even as her pulse hammered against her throat. Years of balancing trays in Chicago's most exclusive establishments teaching her that survival meant performing calm while chaos churned beneath the surface. The man they called Dante Marconi sat at table 14, positioned against the exposed brick wall, where the restaurant's original 1,920 seconds architecture met modern renovations that cost more per square foot than Maya's annual salary. His presence at Colette had become a Thursday ritual over the past 6 months, arriving at exactly 8:30, ordering the same Barolo, requesting the filet rare with a precision that suggested a man who understood that details separated power from pretension. Maya had served him exactly twice before tonight, earning the privilege through what the floor manager called exceptional situational awareness, a fancy term for noticing that Mr. Marconi preferred his water without ice, his bread plate removed entirely, and absolute silence unless he initiated conversation. Other servers found him intimidating, the way his dark eyes catalogued everything without seeming to look at anything directly, the economy of his movements suggesting coiled energy that could explode or dissipate depending on calculations. Only he understood. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. She'd learned to read men like him growing up in Pilsen, where her father had worked construction for developers who paid in cash and asked no questions about immigration papers, where her mother cleaned the homes of people who never learned her name, returning each evening with stories about wealth so casual it felt obscene. Maya had inherited her mother's ability to become invisible in plain sight, to observe without being observed, to understand that power lived in the spaces between what people said and what they meant. Tonight felt wrong from the moment she'd arrived for her shift. The February cold had settled over Chicago like a held breath, Lake Michigan frozen at its edges while the city's heart continued pulsing with its usual indifference to weather. Inside Colette, Edison bulbs cast amber light across reclaimed wood tables and leather banquettes, creating shadows that moved with flickering unpredictability. The restaurant occupied a converted warehouse in the West Loop, its industrial bones softened by velvet curtains and arrangements of pampas grass that cost more than Maya's monthly rent. The clientele skewed toward old money, pretending to be casual, and new money trying to buy legitimacy, with occasional appearances by men like Dante Marconi, who existed in a category that required no pretension because their process, power was simply understood. Maya had noticed the man in the navy peacoat 20 minutes before Dante's arrival. He'd entered through the front, declining the hostess's greeting with a curt shake of his head before settling at the bar, despite the dining room being only half full. His positioning gave him clear sightlines to the entrance, to table 14, and to the emergency exit that led to the kitchen's back alley. The peacoat was expensive but worn, the kind of quality that lasted through Chicago winters if you maintained it properly. His hands were wrong, though calloused and scarred in ways that didn't match his otherwise polished appearance. When he ordered whiskey neat, his voice carried an accent Maya couldn't place. Eastern European, maybe, or Russian. Something that suggested he'd learned English as an adult and spoke it with careful precision. She'd served 3 tables between noticing him and Dante's arrival, her attention splitting between remembering orders and tracking the stranger's behavior. He nursed his whiskey without drinking, checked his phone 4 times in 6 minutes, and kept his right hand in his coat pocket with a stillness that made Maya's stomach tighten with recognition she didn't want to acknowledge. When Dante entered at 8:27, 3 minutes early for the first time in 6 months of Thursday visits, Maya's unease crystallized into something sharper. His security was different tonight. Instead of the usual 2 men who positioned themselves at the bar with practiced nonchalance, there were 4, their coverage creating overlapping fields of observation that spoke to heightened threat assessment. The stranger at the bar stiffened almost imperceptibly when Dante passed, his shoulders drawing back a fraction of an inch, his breathing becoming visible in the slight movement of his chest, despite the restaurant's warmth. Maya delivered bread service to table 11, her peripheral vision tracking the stranger's hand emerging from his pocket to check his phone again, this time with deliberate slowness that suggested communication rather than casual scrolling. Dante settled into table 14 with his characteristic economy of movement, accepting the wine list from the sommelier with a nod that contained entire conversations about preference and expectation. Maya approached with her usual precision, water glass already prepared to his specifications, greeting crafted to acknowledge without presuming familiarity. "Good evening, Mr. Marconi. May I start you with Barolo this evening?" His eyes met hers for a fraction longer than usual, smoke-gray irises holding questions he would never voice in public. Something in his expression suggested he felt it too, the wrongness, humming beneath the restaurant's carefully orchestrated atmosphere. The sense that performances were being staged by actors who'd rehearsed different scripts. "Please," he replied, his voice carrying the texture of expensive whiskey aged in charred oak barrels, smooth but with an edge that suggested consequences for those who mistook refinement for weakness. Maya retreated to the service station, her mind cataloging details with the academic precision she'd developed through 3 years of night classes at DePaul. A criminal justice major, specializing in organized crime structures and behavioral analysis, her textbooks are filled with theories about hierarchy and violence that she'd never expected to see, manifested in real time across white tablecloths and wine pairings worth more than her weekly paycheck. The sommelier poured Dante's Barolo with ceremonial focus, the ruby liquid catching light in ways that made it look almost black in the Edison bulb's amber glow. Maya delivered his first course crudo with compressed melon and chili oil arranged like abstract art, and that's when she saw him. The man had entered through the kitchen access hallway, moving with the confidence of someone who belonged there, wearing chef's whites that fit well enough to pass casual inspection, but hung slightly wrong on shoulders too broad for standard culinary builds. He carried a bus tub filled with folded linens, his path taking him past the service station, where extra napkins and flatware were stored for mid-service restocking. Maya watched him set the tub down near table 14's section, watched him reach into the linens with movements too quick and practiced casual rearrangement, watched him crouch beside the table's pedestal base for exactly 4 seconds, his hands working beneath the tablecloth's drape where diners' legs would hide most activity from casual observation. When he stood, his expression remained neutral, professional, entirely unremarkable. But Maya had grown up in neighborhoods where survival meant noticing the moments when people performed normalcy too perfectly, when the absence of nervousness became its own red flag because genuine calm came from habit while performing calm came from necessity. The man in chef's whites moved back toward the kitchen hallway, his pace measured, unhurried. The bus tub remained near the service station, forgotten or abandoned, the linens inside looking exactly like any other napkins waiting to be distributed to tables that needed them. Maya's breath caught as understanding crystallized with the same clarity her professors described when discussing how pattern recognition evolved from instinct to conscious awareness. The stranger at the bar checking his phone with deliberate timing. The fake chef accessed the dining room through kitchen passages that required either authorization or confident deception. The positioning of table 14 against the brick wall, load-bearing, structural, positioned to contain or direct blast force in specific directions. Her hands trembled as she reached for a napkin from the service station, the white linen square feeling impossibly fragile for what she needed it to contain. The ballpoint pen emerged from her apron pocket, her father's voice echoing in memory about how documentation mattered, how written words carried weight that spoken promises never could in worlds where power operated outside official channels. The words flowed onto fabric with brutal economy. Bomb under table. 4 minutes. Walk slow. Don't warn them. The last instruction felt crucial. If Dante evacuated the restaurant, the bomber would know his device had been discovered, would potentially detonate remotely, rather than lose the opportunity entirely. Other diners filled Colette's dining room, couples celebrating anniversaries, business dinners conducting negotiations over wagyu and wine, families marking occasions that felt important enough to justify the prices. If Dante warned them, ran, created panic, the device would likely detonate immediately. But if he left casually, naturally, as though simply stepping out for a phone call or to speak with someone outside, there might be time to evacuate after he'd cleared the building. Time, measured in seconds, that could mean the difference between contained damage and catastrophic casualties. Maya's approach to table 14 required every ounce of control she'd developed through years of service work, each step calibrated to appear routine despite the napkin folded in her palm like a grenade. Dante was examining the crudo with the focus of someone who understood that appreciation required attention, his fork poised over compressed melon that had been torched to caramelization. "Mr. Marconi," Maya said softly, her voice steady despite the blood rushing in her ears like Lake Michigan during storm surge. "I noticed your napkin has a stain. Let me replace it for you." She reached across with practiced efficiency, lifting his unused napkin from his lap where it remained perfectly folded, replacing it with the one containing her warning. Her fingers brushed his hand for less than a second as she made the exchange, long enough to feel the calluses beneath the refinement. Dante's expression didn't change as he accepted the new napkin, unfolding it with the same measured attention he brought to everything. His eyes tracked across the words Maya had written, reading once, then again. His only reaction, the slight tightening at the corners of his mouth, that might have been anger or calculation, or simply acknowledgement of information received. The restaurant continued its orchestrated chaos around them, servers navigating between tables with balletic precision, the kitchen's expediter calling orders through the pass, the bar mixing cocktails that required smoke and garnishes expensive enough to photograph. Normal service continued while a timer counted down beneath table 14's pedestal base, hidden behind the tablecloth's drape where Dante's left leg would have been positioned if he'd sat differently. Dante set the napkin beside his plate with deliberate care, his movements suggesting consideration rather than alarm. He lifted his wine glass, taking a single sip, with the appreciation of someone savoring a moment rather than rushing toward exits. When he set it down, he met Maya's eyes with an intensity that felt like being catalogued, assessed, evaluated for qualities she didn't know she possessed. "Tell me," he said quietly, his voice pitched low enough that only she could hear. "How confident are you?" The question hung between them, like a bridge extending over an abyss, requiring a leap of faith Maya hadn't known she'd need to make when she'd tied her apron strings 4 hours earlier. She thought about the fake chef's practiced movements, about the stranger at the bar whose hand remained in his peacoat pocket, about her textbooks on organized crime that discussed bomb threats and territorial disputes, and the mathematical precision with which violence operated in worlds where law enforcement was obstacle rather than resource. "Confident enough to risk your life on it," Maya replied, surprised by her own certainty, by the way instinct had crystallized into conviction, without space for doubt. Something shifted in Dante's expression, a microscopic adjustment that might have been respect or simply acknowledgement that she'd answered honestly, rather than offering false reassurance. He placed his napkin over his unfinished crudo, the gesture looking natural enough to be simple preference rather than coded communication. "Thank you for the excellent service," Dante said, his voice carrying normal volume now, performing casualness for anyone listening. "I need to take a call. I'll return shortly." He stood with the unhurried grace that never left him, even now with seconds counting down toward detonation. His hand reached inside his suit jacket, emerging with a phone he checked briefly before moving toward the entrance, with steps that suggested mild inconvenience rather than evacuation under threat of imminent death. Maya watched him pass the stranger at the bar, watched the stranger's grip tighten on his glass as Dante continued out the front entrance without breaking stride. Watched Dante's security team materialize from their positions, following at discreet distances that maintained the illusion of normalcy while creating a protective buffer. The front door closed behind the last security guard. Maya counted seconds in her head. 12. Since Dante stood. 18 since he'd left the dining room. 23 since he'd crossed the threshold into February cold, that suddenly seemed infinitely preferable to Colette's carefully maintained warmth. She moved toward the hostess stand with practiced efficiency, her voice calm despite the adrenaline making her fingertips numb. "Gianna, we need to evacuate. Now. Fire alarm protocol, but calm. Don't mention fire, say there's a gas leak detected in the kitchen." The hostess's eyes widened, but training overrode confusion. She lifted the microphone used for calling reservations, her voice projecting across the dining room with apologetic professionalism. "Ladies and gentlemen, we've detected a potential gas leak in our kitchen. For your safety, we need everyone to exit calmly through the front entrance. Please leave your belongings, staff will secure everything. We apologize for the inconvenience." The kitchen manager appeared from the pass, his face flushed with the heat of service, confusion evident until Maya caught his eye and mouthed a single word: "Bomb." His complexion drained from red to ash gray in the time it took to process 2 syllables. He turned back toward the kitchen, voice booming with authority that cut through the cook's concentration. "Everyone out. Back exit now. Leave everything." Maya moved through the dining room, helping elderly guests from their chairs, guiding families toward the entrance with practiced efficiency that made evacuation feel like a guided tour rather than life-threatening emergency. The stranger at the bar remained frozen, his hand emerging from his peacoat pocket, empty now, his expression cycling through confusion and realization and something that looked dangerously close to panic. 60 seconds since Dante had left. 90. The dining room emptied with the kind of organized chaos that came from well-trained staff executing emergency protocols they'd practiced but never expected to use. 2 minutes. The last family cleared the threshold, parents carrying children who complained about leaving dessert unfinished, unaware that chocolate soufflé was vastly inferior to continued existence. Maya made a final sweep of the dining room, checking bathrooms and coat check, her heart hammering against her ribs with the understanding that she was now betting her own life on the accuracy of her assessment. 2 minutes 40 seconds. The kitchen had emptied through the back alley, staff huddled in February cold without coats, their confusion evident in clouds of breath that dissipated in frozen air. She reached the entrance just as the stranger from the bar moved, his movements suddenly urgent, phone pressed to his ear, mouth forming words Maya couldn't hear through the blood rushing in her ears. 3 minutes 15 seconds. The door swung open, Lake Michigan wind cutting through her work clothes like knives made of ice. 3 minutes 30 seconds. The explosion, when it came, was smaller than movies had taught her to expect. No dramatic fireball or window-shattering blast that threw bodies through the air. Just a deep, compressed thump that she felt through her feet, followed by the sound of structural collapse as Table 14's pedestal base shattered, marble and wood fragmenting inward toward the brick wall that contained most of the force. The front windows cracked but held, tempered glass spiderwebbing without fully failing. Dust bloomed from the entrance in a gray cloud that caught the streetlight and looked almost beautiful in its deadliness. Car alarms triggered along the block in cascading sequence, their wailing creating a symphony of violation that matched the violation of safety everyone had assumed was guaranteed in places that charged $40 for appetizers. Maya stood on the sidewalk, surrounded by staff and guests, all of them staring at the restaurant with expressions cycling through shock and confusion, and the slow dawning understanding that they'd just survived something that could have killed them. The stranger from the bar had vanished, his absence more obvious now than his presence had been, the space where he'd stood somehow louder than the alarms still wailing. Sirens approached from multiple directions, Chicago emergency services converging with the efficiency of a city that had experienced enough violence to perfect its response protocols. Maya's hands shook as adrenaline finally caught up with action, her body processing what her mind had been too focused to acknowledge during the evacuation. A black sedan pulled to the curb 20 feet from Colette's entrance, its arrival feeling both impossible and inevitable. The rear door opened, and Dante Marconi emerged into cold that turned his breath to smoke, his expression carefully neutral as he surveyed the restaurant with eyes that missed nothing. He approached Maya with measured steps, his security forming a perimeter that looked casual but operated with military precision. Other evacuees were too focused on their own survival to notice the man who'd left minutes before the explosion, too absorbed in recording damage on phones and calling loved ones to mark his return. "You saved 73 lives tonight," Dante said quietly when he reached her, his voice carrying the weight of calculations he'd apparently been making while she'd been evacuating. "Including mine. That creates obligations neither of us asked for, but both of us will have to navigate." Maya's teeth chattered from cold and shock combined, her work clothes entirely insufficient for standing in Chicago February while processing the fact that she'd just prevented a mass casualty bombing. "I just did what anyone would do," she managed, though they both knew that was a lie. "No," Dante replied, something like respect softening his features in ways she'd never seen during his Thursday dinners. "You did what almost no one would do. You risked everything on instinct and observation, and you stayed to make sure others survived even when you could have run. That's not common. That's exceptional." The first police car arrived, officers emerging with hands on weapons, eyes scanning for threats that had already disappeared into Chicago's endless maze of buildings and alleys. Maya knew what came next, questions and statements and suspicion about how she'd known, about what she'd seen, about whether her warning to Dante Marconi marked her as ally or accomplice. "They're going to ask about you," Maya said, watching the officers begin securing the scene with yellow tape that fluttered in wind, carrying snow that hadn't started falling yet, but felt imminent. "About how I knew to tell you specifically." "Tell them the truth," Dante replied, his eyes tracking the officers' movements with the assessment of someone who understood law enforcement as obstacle rather than protection. "You noticed suspicious behavior and acted accordingly. Anything beyond that is speculation they can't prove, because it doesn't exist in any official capacity." He reached into his suit jacket, extracting a business card that he pressed into Maya's palm with the kind of deliberate contact that felt like contract negotiation rather than simple information exchange. The card was heavy stock, cream-colored, with a single phone number embossed in gold ink that caught the streetlight's orange glow. "When they're done questioning you, when you've given your statement and gone home and realized you can't sleep because adrenaline doesn't respect exhaustion, call that number," Dante said, his voice carrying certainty about her future that felt presumptuous and accurate. Simultaneously, what happened tonight created connections that don't dissolve just because the immediate threat passed. "You're part of something now, whether you intended to be or not. Detective Ramirez approached before Maya could respond, her badge reflecting emergency lights, as she introduced herself with the kind of calm that came from years of processing Chicago's endless violence. "I'm going to need statements from everyone who was inside," she said, her eyes shifting between Maya and Dante, with the sharp assessment of someone trained to notice when performances were being staged. "Of course," Maya replied, pocketing the business card with movements she hoped looked casual despite her hands still trembling. "I'm happy to help however I can." Dante nodded once to the detective, then returned to his sedan with the same unhurried grace he'd used to leave the restaurant, as though bombs and evacuations were simply inconveniences, requiring adaptation rather than emergencies, demanding panic. The car pulled away into traffic that parted for it without honking, without resistance, as though other drivers instinctively understood that some vehicles operated under different rules than ordinary commuters. The next 3 hours blurred into repetitive questioning and statement-giving, Maya explaining again and again how she'd noticed the fake chef, how instinct had screamed danger, how she'd made the split-second decision to warn the guest at table 14 because his position put him in the most immediate danger. She didn't mention knowing his name, didn't reference his Thursday ritual visits, didn't explain that she'd recognized his security team because she'd been trained to identify protective details in her criminal justice coursework. Detective Ramirez circled back to Dante multiple times, her questions growing sharper with each repetition. "You're sure you don't know Dante Marconi beyond serving him dinner a couple times? No relationship outside the restaurant? No reason he'd specifically trust a warning from you?" "I'm good at my job," Maya replied, exhaustion making honesty easier than elaborate deception. "I notice things. Tonight I noticed something that felt wrong, and I acted on it. If the guest at that table had been anyone else, I would have done the same thing." The lie sat on her tongue like copper, metallic and unpleasant, but necessary, because the truth that she'd recognized the bombing as part of organized crime territorial disputes her textbooks discussed in abstract terms, that she'd understood instinctively how to communicate threat to someone who operated in worlds where police involvement came after violence, rather than preventing it, would create questions that had no good answers. Dawn was breaking over Lake Michigan by the time Ramirez finally released her, the sky lightening from black to gray to the pale blue that Chicago winter mornings wore like bruises. Maya's apartment was 3 miles south in Pilsen, walkable if she wanted the time to process, too far if exhaustion won the negotiation happening between her body's demands and her mind's inability to stop replaying the night's events. She chose walking, her feet carrying her through streets beginning their morning routines, past commuters heading to early shifts and homeless people seeking shelter from cold that intensified as the sun rose without warmth. The business card in her pocket felt heavier than paper should, its weight pressing against her thigh like a brand marking ownership she hadn't consented to but couldn't deny. Maya's apartment had never felt smaller than it did at 7 in the morning after preventing a bombing. The studio's 400 square feet contained everything she owned in the world: a futon that served as both couch and bed, a desk salvaged from a DePaul dumpster, textbooks stacked in precarious towers that threatened collapse every time the radiator banged to life. The single window overlooked an alley where morning light struggled to penetrate the gap between buildings, creating a perpetual twilight that matched her current state of exhausted hyper-awareness. She stood under the shower until the hot water ran cold, trying to wash away the scent of dust and explosion that clung to her hair, her skin, the inside of her nostrils where it had settled like sediment. Her work clothes went directly into a garbage bag, the white shirt stained with soot, the black pants torn at the knee from kneeling to help an elderly woman during evacuation, evidence of a night that felt simultaneously real and impossible. Sleep should have come easily after 36 hours of consciousness stretched thin by adrenaline and fear. But every time Maya closed her eyes, she saw the fake chef's practiced movements beneath table 14, saw Dante's expression as he read her warning, saw the dust cloud blooming from Colette's entrance, like a gray flower opening its petals to reveal death inside. At 9:15, her phone rang with a number she didn't recognize. Maya stared at the screen for 3 rings before answering, her voice rough from smoke inhalation she hadn't realized had occurred until speaking forced recognition. "Miss Reeves, this is Amanda Chen from the university. I'm calling regarding your enrollment status." Maya's stomach dropped with the velocity of free fall, understanding crystallizing before the explanation came. "I haven't missed any payments," she said carefully, though she knew financial aid wasn't why DePaul's registrar was calling on a Friday morning. "No, your account is current. However, we've been contacted by Chicago police regarding an incident last night." The university has policies about students involved in criminal investigations, particularly those pursuing criminal justice degrees. We need you to come in for a meeting with the dean of students. The implication hung between them like smoke. Maya's proximity to organized crime, her warning, to a man the police undoubtedly had files on, her decision to involve herself in violence that students were supposed to study theoretically rather than navigate practically. Academia's sanitized version of crime didn't include actually touching it, actually making split-second decisions that saved lives but complicated institutional liability. When? Maya asked, exhaustion making her voice flat where anxiety should have sharpened it. Monday at 10. I've emailed you the details. Please don't be late, Miss Reeves. These matters are taken very seriously. The call ended before Maya could respond, leaving her staring at a phone that felt like it weighed 50 pounds. 3 years of night classes while working double shifts. 3 years of maintaining a 4.0 GPA through sheer force of will and refusal to let exhaustion compromise excellence. 3 years of building toward a future that suddenly looked as unstable as Table 14's pedestal base after the explosion. She should sleep. Should let unconsciousness claim the hours between now and the meeting that would likely determine whether her degree survived her decision to save 73 lives. But her mind refused to stop cataloging details, replaying moments, analyzing patterns with the same academic precision her professors had taught her to apply to case studies that remained safely confined to textbooks and hypothetical discussions. The business card sat on her desk where she'd placed it after undressing, its cream surface catching the weak alley light in ways that made the embossed gold number seem to pulse. Maya picked it up, feeling the weight of expensive cardstock that spoke to resources beyond what ordinary businesses allocated to contact information. No name, no company, no indication of what the number connected to beyond Dante Marconi's implicit promise that calling would answer questions she hadn't yet learned to ask. Her phone showed 11:47 when she finally pressed the digits, her finger trembling slightly as the connection clicked through with a sound that felt like crossing a threshold that had no return path. The line rang once before a voice answered, male, professional, accented in ways that suggested multiple languages spoken with native fluency. Miss Reeves. Mr. Marconi has been expecting your call. No greeting, no identification, just immediate acknowledgement that she'd been anticipated, prepared for, cataloged in whatever systems Dante's organization maintained for tracking people whose lives intersected with his own. The efficiency should have frightened her, but exhaustion had burned through her capacity for additional fear. I need to understand what happens now, Maya said, her directness surprising herself. The police questioned me for 3 hours. My university called about a disciplinary meeting. I saved your employer's life and now mine is falling apart. Your life is not falling apart, Miss Reeves. It is transforming. Mr. Marconi would like to discuss the distinction in person. There's a car waiting downstairs. Maya moved to her window, peering down at the alley where a black sedan idled with the same stillness Dante brought to every space he occupied. No flashy luxury vehicle, nothing that would draw attention in Pilsen's working-class neighborhood, just understated quality that spoke to resources deployed with strategic precision rather than ostentatious display. I haven't agreed to anything, she said, though they both knew that calling the number had been agreed enough, that curiosity and necessity had already overridden whatever reservations she might claim to possess. The car will wait. The voice replied with patience that suggested time operated differently for people in Dante's orbit. Mr. Marconi understands that decisions of this magnitude require consideration, but he also understands that consideration often benefits from information that can only be provided through conversation. The line went dead before Maya could respond, leaving her staring at an alley and a car that represented choices she'd never expected to face when she'd enrolled in criminal justice courses that treated organized crime as a sociological phenomenon rather than immediate reality requiring navigation. She dressed in jeans and a sweater that had belonged to her father, its wool still carrying the scent of his cigarettes despite 3 years since the construction accident that had killed him instantly, replacing presence with absence and stability with the kind of financial precariousness that had driven Maya toward night classes and restaurant work, and the desperate calculus of building a future from the fragments of a shattered past. The February cold hit her face like punishment when she exited her building, wind carrying snow that had finally started falling in flakes so small they seemed more like frozen mist than actual precipitation. The sedan's rear door opened as she approached, revealing a leather interior warm enough that stepping inside felt like entering a different climate zone entirely. The driver said nothing as they pulled into traffic, his eyes tracking mirrors with the constant vigilance Maya recognized from Dante's security team. They drove north and east, leaving Pilsen's familiar streets for neighborhoods where brownstones cost millions and winters were endured behind triple-paned windows that insulated residents from the same cold that killed homeless people sleeping in Lower Wacker Drive's endless tunnels. The building they stopped at looked unremarkable from outside a converted warehouse in River North with exposed brick and industrial windows, the kind of structure developers transformed into expensive lofts that maintained aesthetic roughness while eliminating any actual discomfort. The driver opened her door, gesturing toward an entrance where a man in a suit waited with the same professional courtesy that masked constant threat. Assessment. Inside, the space defied exterior expectations. Not residential, but not quite commercial either, more like a private club that operated without the publicity clubs typically required to justify their existence. Dark wood paneling absorbed light from fixtures that looked like they'd been salvaged from a 1,922nd speakeasy, creating an atmosphere that felt both historical and entirely manufactured for specific effect. Dante Marconi stood near floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Chicago River, his silhouette backlit by afternoon sun that had burned through cloud cover to create the kind of winter brightness that hurt eyes adjusted to studio apartment dimness. He turned as Maya entered, his expression holding the same measured assessment he'd displayed at Colette, as though she were a problem requiring solution rather than a person requiring acknowledgement. "Thank you for coming," he said, gesturing toward leather chairs positioned near a fireplace where gas flames created warmth without the mess of actual burning wood. "I imagine you have questions." Maya remained standing, refusing the implied invitation to settle into comfort that might compromise the clarity exhaustion had somehow sharpened rather than dulled. "The police think I'm involved in organized crime. My university is threatening my enrollment. I prevented a bombing and now I'm the one being investigated. So yes, I have questions. Starting with why protecting you has destroyed my life." Something shifted in Dante's expression. Surprise maybe, or respect for directness that matched his own economical approach to communication. He moved from the window to the bar cart positioned against the far wall, pouring amber liquid into crystal glasses with the precision he brought to everything. "Your life was already in danger the moment you noticed the bomber," Dante said, returning with both glasses, offering one to Maya despite her continued refusal to sit. "The Kozlov family doesn't forgive witnesses who interfere with their operations. The bomb was meant to eliminate me during a meeting they believed would happen at Colette last night. Your warning didn't just save my life, it revealed their intelligence breach and prevented them from achieving their primary objective." Maya accepted the glass because her hands needed something to hold, something to prevent them from trembling as the implications he was describing crystallized into something she could no longer deny through willful ignorance. "So they'll come after me now, to eliminate the witness who can identify their operative." "They've already identified you," Dante confirmed, his honesty somehow more frightening than reassuring lies would have been. "Chicago PD's investigation created a paper trail that Kozlov's people accessed within hours of your statement. They know your name, your address, your university enrollment, your work schedule. They know everything about you that public records and basic surveillance can reveal." The whiskey burned going down, its heat spreading through Maya's chest without providing actual warmth. She finally sat, not because Dante's invitation had become more appealing, but because her legs suddenly felt incapable of supporting her weight while processing information that transformed last night's heroism into today's liability. "You're telling me I'm going to die because I saved your life," she said flatly, anger cutting through fear with the kind of clarity that came from having nothing left to lose. "I'm telling you that your previous life ended the moment you wrote that warning," Dante corrected, settling into the chair opposite hers, with the relaxed posture of someone delivering news he'd anticipated having to share. "But that doesn't mean your life itself has to end. It means you need protection that operates outside normal channels. It means accepting help from someone who understands the threat and has resources to counter it." Maya laughed, without humor, the sound sharp against the fireplace's soft crackling. "Let me guess you're offering to protect me. The mafia boss whose life I saved now gets to control mine as payment for keeping me alive. How is that different from being dead?" "It's different," Dante said quietly, his eyes holding hers with intensity that made looking away feel like surrender. "Because death is permanent and protection is negotiable. I'm not offering to control you, Miss Reeves. I'm offering to ensure you survive long enough to finish your degree, to build the future you've been working toward, to live beyond this moment when violence touched your life through no fault of your own. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything, and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. The fire popped, sending sparks against the glass screen that contained them safely. Performance of danger without actual threat. Maya thought about her apartment's useless locks, about walking through Pilsen's streets where Kozlov's people could approach from any direction, about the meeting Monday morning where DePaul would likely expel her for bringing organized crime drama into their carefully sanitized academic environment. "What exactly are you proposing?" she asked, the question acknowledging what they both knew, that she had no real choice, that survival required accepting help she'd never wanted to need, that autonomy was luxury afforded only to people whose lives hadn't intersected with violence that operated beyond law enforcement's ability or willingness to contain. "You move out of your apartment today, into a property I own that has security. Kozlov's people can't penetrate without triggering responses they're not prepared to face. You continue your classes remotely until the semester ends. I have connections at DePaul who can arrange for online completion without academic penalty. You learn how my world operates, so you understand the threats you're facing and can recognize danger before it reaches you." Dante leaned forward, his expression softening in ways that suggested the offer was personal, rather than purely transactional. "And when Kozlov's vendetta burns itself out, when his family realizes that pursuing you costs more than abandoning the grudge, you return to your life with education completed and future intact. Changed by the experience, yes, but alive to experience anything at all." Maya studied him across the firelight, trying to reconcile the man who ordered rare steak with silent precision, with the man offering to upend his own life, to protect someone he'd known only through brief Thursday interactions. "Why?" she asked simply. "Why commit resources to keeping me safe? You could eliminate the threat by eliminating me, one less witness, one less complication." Something dark crossed Dante's face, emotion breaking through the control he maintained, like armor against the world's casual cruelty. "Because you risked everything to save not just me, but 73 people you didn't know. Because when you could have run, you stayed to ensure others survived. Because that kind of courage deserves protection, not punishment." He stood, moving back to the window where Chicago spread below like a map, marking territories and conflicts that most residents never knew existed beneath the city's legitimate surface. "And because I've spent 20 years in this life watching good people suffer consequences for proximity to violence they didn't choose. If I can prevent that outcome once, for one person who deserves better, then maybe I'm not entirely the monster my reputation suggests." The vulnerability in his voice felt dangerous, not because it threatened Maya's safety, but because it threatened her ability to maintain the emotional distance that survival probably required. Accepting his protection meant entering his world, meant understanding him as a person rather than archetype, meant complicating her academic study of organized crime with the messy reality that criminals were people who made choices for reasons that textbooks reduced to sociological factors, rather than acknowledging human complexity. "I need to pack my things," Maya said quietly, the statement, acknowledging acceptance without forcing herself to voice the words that felt like surrender, even though they represented survival. Dante nodded, pulling his phone from his suit jacket. "My people will help you move. Take everything that matters. You won't be returning to that apartment. Consider it a closed chapter, a necessary ending to make space for whatever comes next." Within 2 hours, Maya's entire life had been packed into boxes and loaded into a truck that drove north toward Lakeshore Drive and a building that overlooked water frozen at its edges while remaining liquid at its core, solid and flowing simultaneously, trapped and free in the Bresse, same space where temperatures negotiated the line between states. The penthouse apartment Dante provided occupied the entire 42nd floor, its windows offering views of Lake Michigan that stretched to horizons where water met sky in seamless gradients of gray and blue. The space felt more like a luxury hotel than a residence professionally decorated in neutrals that revealed nothing about the person who owned it, furnished with pieces that prioritized comfort without displaying personality. "This is where you stay when you're not at your actual home?" Maya asked, setting her bag on marble flooring that probably cost more per square foot than her entire apartment's monthly rent. "This is where people stay who need distance from their normal lives," Dante corrected, his voice echoing slightly in the open floor plan. "I own properties throughout Chicago, most of them serving similar purposes. Safe houses, essentially, though significantly more comfortable than the term suggests." He moved through the space with familiarity that suggested frequent use, pointing out features that Maya's exhausted brain struggled to process: security system integrated into building infrastructure, panic buttons in every room, reinforced entry points that looked decorative but functioned as barriers capable of withstanding forced entry for the minutes necessary for his security team to respond. "You'll have 2 guards stationed in the building at all times," Dante continued, his tone shifting into something more businesslike, as though discussing her captivity, because that's what this was, wasn't it? Luxurious captivity required professional distance. They'll maintain discreet positions, but they're authorized to intervene if any threat approaches. You're not a prisoner, Miss Reeves, but you are protected, whether you venture out or remain inside. "When does my life go back to normal?" Maya asked, though she already suspected the answer. "When Kozlov decides the cost of pursuing you exceeds the benefit of eliminating a witness," Dante replied, his reflection appearing beside hers in the window's surface. "Or when we eliminate the threat permanently. Either outcome requires patience and strategic action that can't be rushed without creating additional danger." He placed a phone on the counter, a new device, unlisted number, the kind of burner that criminals used in movies and apparently in real life when protecting witnesses from other criminals. "My direct line is programmed in. Call day or night if you need anything or notice anything unusual. The security team's number is there too, though they'll be monitoring regardless of whether you contact them." Maya picked up the phone, its weight somehow heavier than devices should be, as though the technology carried obligation beyond its function. "How long have you been doing this?" she asked. "Protecting people, I mean. Creating safe houses and security teams and elaborate systems for keeping witnesses alive?" Dante's expression shifted into something that might have been sadness or simply acceptance of roles he'd been playing so long they'd become identity rather than performance. Long enough to understand that violence creates responsibility, that power means nothing if it can't be used to protect people who deserve protection, that sometimes the best thing monsters can do is ensure other monsters don't win. He moved toward the door, preparing to leave her alone in luxury that felt more like isolation than security. At the threshold, he paused, turning back with an expression she couldn't quite read in the apartment's ambient lighting. "You saved my life, Miss Reeves. Everything I'm doing now is simply returning the favor. No debt, no obligation, beyond ensuring you survive to live whatever life you choose once this is over." The door closed with a soft click that sounded like finality, leaving Maya alone with views that cost fortunes and silence that felt like its own kind of violence. She moved through the apartment mechanically, opening closets filled with clothes in her size. Someone had clearly been shopping while she'd been packing, and had anticipated her measurements and preferences with accuracy that felt invasive and thoughtful simultaneously. The bedroom overlooked the lake from a different angle, a king-sized bed made with linens that probably had thread counts higher than her former rent. The ensuite bathroom featured a shower with more settings than her car had, marble surfaces that reflected her exhausted face in ways that made her look older than 23, as though the past 18 hours had aged her in ways that wouldn't reverse when the threat passed. Sleep came eventually. She dreamed of explosions, and Dante's eyes reading her warning. The weekend passed in strange suspension time, moving forward without Maya feeling like she was moving with it. Saturday brought breakfast delivered by security who knocked once and left, bags from restaurants she'd never been able to afford when paying her own way. Sunday brought books and laptops and emails from DePaul confirming that she'd been approved for remote learning through semester's end. The academic bureaucracy apparently more responsive when someone with Dante's resources made requests. She tried to focus on coursework, on reading about organized crime structures while living inside one, but the academic language felt inadequate for describing her current reality. Textbooks discussed hierarchy and territorial disputes and economic motivations, reducing human complexity to charts and theories that held no space for the fact that criminals made decisions for reasons as complicated as anyone else's, that violence emerged from contexts that couldn't be mapped onto simple models of cause and effect. Monday morning arrived, with the clarity of the crisis past, and the future uncertain. Maya dressed in clothes from the closet that fit perfectly despite her never providing measurements, understanding that Dante's organization operated with the kind of thoroughness that meant privacy was illusion and observation was constant even when it felt like solitude. The view from the window showed commuters heading to work, buses and trains carrying people to jobs where the worst danger was office politics and deadline pressure, where violence remained a theoretical concern rather than immediate threat. Maya pressed her forehead against cold glass, wondering how long before she could rejoin that world, how long before normal became accessible again, rather than remaining impossibly distant behind barriers of security and threat. Her phone buzzed, not the burner but her actual phone, the one she'd kept despite Dante's advice. That communication with her previous life created vulnerabilities his security couldn't fully contain. The caller ID showed Detective Ramirez, the same officer who'd questioned her for 3 hours Friday morning while Colette's ruins smoldered and crime scene techs cataloged evidence of violence prevented rather than violence achieved. Maya answered with reluctance that felt like stone in her stomach. "Hello? Miss Reeves, I need you to come down to the station. We have additional questions about the bombing, about your relationship with Dante Marconi, about what you're not telling us." Ramirez's voice carried the edge of suspicion earned, the kind of certainty that came from years of recognizing when witnesses performed innocence while hiding guilt. "I already gave you my statement," Maya replied, moving away from the window as though distance from the view would somehow protect her from the detective's questions. "I noticed suspicious behavior. I warned the guest I was serving. I evacuated the restaurant. I don't know what else you think I can tell you. You can tell me why you're no longer at your Pilsen apartment, why your phone's location data shows you're currently in a building owned by one of Marconi's shell corporations, why a woman who's supposedly just a waitress caught in the wrong place at the wrong time has moved into a penthouse that rents for $20,000 a month." The information felt like violation. Not that Ramirez had traced her, but that Maya's attempt at security had been so easily penetrated by simple police work. She thought about Dante's assurances of protection, about security teams and panic buttons, realizing that no amount of private security could protect against law enforcement determined to build cases against targets they'd been pursuing for years. "I'm a witness who received threats," Maya said carefully, the half-truth easier than explaining the full complexity of her situation. "Mr. Marconi offered protection until the threat passes. I accepted because I'd like to survive long enough to graduate." "Threats from who?" Ramirez pressed, her tone suggesting she already knew the answer, that the question was a test rather than an inquiry. "Did Marconi tell you that you're in danger? Did he suggest that only he could keep you safe? Because that's how recruitment works, Miss Reeves. Create the threat, offer the solution, and suddenly witnesses become accomplices without realizing they've crossed the line." The accusation hung between them like smoke. Impossible to see through clearly, impossible to deny without seeming defensive. Maya thought about the fake chef's practiced movements, about the stranger at the bar whose hand never left his peacoat pocket, about the explosion that had been real regardless of what Ramirez was suggesting about Dante's motivations. The bomb was real, Maya said quietly, anger cutting through fear. 73 people could have died if I hadn't warned Mr. Marconi. Whether you believe his protection is genuine or manipulation doesn't change the fact that I'm alive today because I accepted help from someone with resources to provide it. Silence stretched across the line Ramirez, considering her response, or consulting with other officers, or simply letting Maya's words settle into spaces where doubt could grow. "Come to the station voluntarily, Miss Reeves, or I'll get a warrant. Your choice. But either way, we're having this conversation today." The line went dead before Maya could respond, leaving her staring at a phone that felt like evidence of guilt she hadn't committed, of choices made under duress that somehow looked like willing participation when viewed from outside the context that had created them. She called Dante's number without thinking, without planning what to say, driven by instinct that survival required information she couldn't access alone. He answered on the first ring, his voice alert despite the early hour, as though sleep was luxury he'd learned to function without. "Ramirez called," Maya said without preamble. "She knows I'm here. She's threatening a warrant if I don't come in voluntarily. She thinks you're manipulating me, creating the threat, to justify the protection, recruiting me into your organization under the pretense of keeping me safe." Dante's exhale carried weight that suggested he'd anticipated this development, and had probably been planning for it since the moment Maya had accepted his offer. "Don't go to the station. Anything you say will be used to build a case against me, and your association with me is already damaging your credibility as a witness. I'll send my attorney, she'll handle Ramirez, negotiate terms that protect both of us. I can't just ignore a detective's direct request," Maya protested, though she already knew that normal rules about cooperating with law enforcement had stopped applying the moment she'd entered Dante's world. "That makes me look guilty of something." "You are guilty," Dante replied with the bluntness that characterized his communication style. "Guilty of excellent instincts, of saving lives, of accepting protection from someone the police have been investigating for 24 years without sufficient evidence to charge. In Ramirez's world, that makes you either victim or accomplice, and she's decided you're the latter because it serves her case better than acknowledging you simply made smart survival decisions." Maya moved through the apartment restlessly, her body needing movement her mind couldn't properly direct. Energy without outlet, creating tension that coiled in her shoulders like wire pulled too tight. So what do I do? Just hide here while you handle everything? Let you control my life because the alternative is worse? You trust that I have more experience navigating these situations than you do, Dante answered, his voice softening into something that sounded almost like reassurance. You finish your degree remotely, you let my attorney manage the police, and you survive long enough that we're both glad you wrote that warning instead of regretting it. The line stayed open after he finished speaking, neither of them hanging up. Silence, stretching between them like the space between buildings where morning light struggled to penetrate. Maya wanted to argue, to insist on autonomy she no longer possessed, to reclaim control of a life that had been thoroughly disrupted by 3 sentences written in desperation while a timer counted toward detonation. But instead she said simply, "Okay," because sometimes survival required accepting help from monsters who proved more trustworthy than the institutions supposedly designed to protect innocent people from exactly the situations she currently navigated. My attorney will contact you within the hour, Dante said. Her name is Sarah Chen, brilliant, ruthless, experienced in handling cases where organized crime intersects with witness protection. Trust her judgment, even when it feels wrong. She's kept people alive longer than they had any right to expect in situations like yours. He ended the call before Maya could respond, leaving her alone with views worth fortunes and choices worth possibly her life, trying to understand how preventing violence had created obligations she'd never anticipated accepting. Sarah Chen arrived at the penthouse at 9:47 a.m., 13 minutes before Maya's scheduled meeting with Detective Ramirez would have occurred if she'd chosen compliance over survival. The attorney moved through the space with the kind of economical precision that suggested time was currency she refused to waste, her tailored suit and leather briefcase creating an impression of controlled power that reminded Maya of Dante, without his capacity for violence lurking beneath professional veneer. "Miss Reeves," Sarah said, extending a hand that gripped with surprising strength for someone who probably weighed 100 pounds soaking wet. "I've already contacted Detective Ramirez and informed her that you're exercising your right to legal counsel. All future communication with Chicago PD will flow through me. You are not, under any circumstances, to speak with police without my presence." Maya accepted the handshake, noting the calluses that suggested Sarah's power came from more than just legal expertise, martial arts training maybe, or weapons handling, or simply years of gripping pens while drafting documents that kept dangerous men out of prison. "Detective Ramirez thinks I'm being recruited into organized crime. Detective Ramirez thinks everyone who breathes near Dante Marconi is either criminal or victim," Sarah replied, settling onto the leather sofa with movements that suggested complete comfort in luxury spaces. Her obsession with building a RICO case has destroyed 3 promising investigations by pushing too hard too fast. She sees patterns where none exist and misses actual evidence while chasing shadows. The attorney extracted a tablet from her briefcase, swiping through documents with practiced efficiency. "I've reviewed your statement from Friday night. It's clean, no contradictions, no obvious lies, nothing that creates exposure beyond the basic fact that you warned a known organized crime figure about an imminent threat. The problem isn't what you said, it's what Ramirez believes you're not saying." Maya moved to the window. Needing distance from the intensity Sarah brought into the space like weather systems, bringing pressure changes that made breathing feel difficult. "I'm not saying anything because there's nothing to say. I noticed suspicious behavior. I acted on instinct. I saved lives. The fact that one of those lives belongs to someone the police are investigating doesn't make me complicit in whatever crimes they think he commits." "Legally, you're correct," Sarah agreed, her tone suggesting legal correctness and practical reality existed in different universes that rarely aligned. "Practically, your association with Mr. Marconi creates complications that won't resolve through simple logic. The Kozlov family's bombing attempt has triggered federal interest FBI's. Organized Crime Task Force is now involved, which means the investigation has resources and jurisdictional reach that local police lack." The information settled over Maya, like additional weight on shoulders already struggling under burdens she'd never asked to carry. "So it gets worse. Perfect. Anything else I should know about how completely destroyed my life has become?" Sarah's expression softened almost imperceptibly, suggesting that beneath the professional armor lived someone capable of empathy for witnesses caught in machinery they didn't build and couldn't stop. "Your DePaul enrollment is secure. I've negotiated accommodations that allow remote completion without academic penalty. Your apartment lease has been terminated with full return of security deposit. Your former employer at Colette has been advised not to discuss you with anyone, including law enforcement, without referring them to me first." The attorney stood, moving to join Maya at the window. Both of them, looking down at Chicago going about its Monday morning routines, without awareness of the negotiations happening 42 floors above street level. Mr. Marconi is very good at protecting people who matter to him. Your job is to let him do that job without fighting the process so hard that you create vulnerabilities his security can't address. I don't want to matter to him, Maya said quietly, the admission feeling dangerous in ways she couldn't articulate. I don't want to be the person whose life requires this level of intervention. I want to finish my degree and go back to being invisible. Invisibility ended when you wrote that warning, Sarah replied with the bluntness Dante had displayed when explaining the same reality. Now you navigate visibility with people who can teach you to survive it. Mr. Marconi didn't create the threat, Miss Reeves, but he's committed considerable resources to ensuring the threat doesn't succeed. Most people in your situation don't receive that consideration. The attorney returned to her briefcase, extracting business cards and documents that Maya was supposed to sign. Legal architecture, creating frameworks for protection that required paperwork even when the underlying relationships operated outside law's normal boundaries. I need you to sign these acknowledgments that you've been advised of your rights, that you're accepting legal counsel voluntarily, that you understand the implications of your association with Mr. Marconi. Maya signed where indicated, her signature feeling like a contract with terms she couldn't fully understand, but had no choice except to accept. Sarah collected the documents with practiced efficiency, returning them to her briefcase with movements that suggested this ritual had been performed dozens of times, with dozens of other witnesses who'd touched Dante's world and required extraction from consequences. He cares about you, Sarah said as she prepared to leave, the statement landing between them with unexpected weight. I've represented Mr. Marconi for 8 years. I've seen him protect assets and business interests and strategic advantages, but the resources he's deploying for you suggest something beyond tactical necessity. Whatever you did Friday night earned more than gratitude. It earned genuine concern for your well-being. The door closed behind Sarah before Maya could respond, leaving her alone with implications she didn't want to examine too closely. The idea that Dante viewed her as more than a witness requiring management, that his protection came from personal investment rather than purely strategic calculation, complicated her ability to maintain the emotional distance that survival probably required. She spent the afternoon attempting to focus on coursework, reading about criminal enterprise structures while living inside one, her textbook's academic language feeling increasingly inadequate for describing reality that textbooks reduced to theory. Her criminal psychology professor had assigned a paper on witness protection program efficacy, the irony so sharp Maya almost laughed while typing. Analysis of federal programs that couldn't protect her because the threat came from organized crime, and the protection came from organized crime, and the whole situation existed in gray spaces that official systems couldn't acknowledge without exposing their own limitations. Evening arrived with the kind of winter darkness that made Chicago feel like it existed at latitudes farther north than geography suggested. The sun disappearing at 5:30 and leaving the city wrapped in night that would last until morning arrived reluctantly 14 hours later. Maya stood at the window watching lights multiply across the landscape, each illuminated window representing lives she could no longer access. A normalcy that felt impossibly distant despite being separated from her by only 42 floors, and choices made in moments when instinct overrode consideration of consequences. The burner phone buzzed with incoming text from Dante's number. Dinner at 7. Car downstairs at 6:45. Not optional, we need to talk. Maya stared at the message, irritation flaring at the presumption that her time and decisions belonged to him now. That protection came with obligations she hadn't agreed to when she'd accepted his help. But beneath the irritation lived recognition that resistance was performance, that she would go because curiosity and necessity overrode whatever autonomy she might claim to possess. She dressed in black jeans and a sweater, the same casual uniform she'd worn working at Colette when life had been simpler, and violence had remained theoretical concern rather than immediate threat. The security guard in the lobby nodded as she passed, his acknowledgement confirming that her movements were tracked, catalogued, reported to whoever monitored the systems designed to protect her from dangers that multiplied with each passing day. The sedan idled at the curb with engine running, exhaust creating clouds in air cold enough that breathing felt like inhaling knives. The driver held her door with practiced courtesy, his silence somehow more courteous than conversation would have been, acknowledging that Maya probably had no interest in small talk, while being transported to dinner with the mafia boss, whose life she'd saved and who now controlled hers in return. They drove west toward the Loop, traffic heavy with Monday evening commuters heading home to suburbs, where organized crime remained an abstract concern discussed on news programs rather than immediate reality requiring navigation. The restaurant they stopped at looked unremarkable from outside another converted warehouse, another space where industrial Chicago's bones had been softened with money and design that transformed function into fashion. Inside, the space was nearly empty despite the dinner hour. A handful of occupied tables, all positioned far from the private room where Dante waited, his security maintaining a perimeter that ensured privacy without creating the obvious barrier that would advertise the need for such measures. He stood when Maya entered, the courtesy somehow surprising despite his consistent performance of refinement that masked whatever violence lived beneath expensive suits and controlled movements. "Thank you for coming," Dante said, gesturing toward a chair across from his position at a table set for two. Wine already poured, water glasses positioned precisely, bread presented on boards that probably cost more than entire meals at normal restaurants. "I know the message wasn't phrased as a request, but I appreciate your cooperation regardless." Maya sat because standing felt like pointless resistance, accepting the wine because refusing would create awkwardness neither of them needed. Sarah said the FBI is now involved, that the bombing triggered federal interest complicates whatever plans you had for resolving this situation quietly. "Sarah talks too much sometimes," Dante replied, though his tone suggested appreciation rather than criticism. "But yes, federal involvement changes the tactical landscape. The Kozlov family can't operate as freely with FBI surveillance intensifying, which protects you in some ways while exposing you in others." He took a sip of wine, his movements carrying the same measured precision she'd observed during his Thursday dinners, when life had been simpler and their relationship had existed within the clear boundaries of server and customer. "The FBI believes the bombing was targeting a meeting between my organization and the Kozlov family, a peace negotiation that would have prevented escalation into full territorial war. They think you interrupted that meeting, which is partially true. What they don't know is that the meeting was scheduled for next week, not Friday night." Maya processed the information, her academic training helping her map implications that casual observers would miss. So the Kozlov family moved the bombing forward, which means they never intended to negotiate. The meeting was covered for assassination. "Exactly," Dante confirmed, something like approval warming his expression. "Your instincts saved not just my life, but prevented war that would have killed dozens and destroyed neighborhoods where violence would have been most concentrated. The FBI doesn't see it that way. They see a prevented meeting as a lost intelligence opportunity. But anyone who understands Chicago's organized crime landscape knows you prevented catastrophe." The first course arrived, scallops seared to perfection, presented on plates that looked like art installations rather than food service. Maya ate mechanically, her appetite diminished by stress, but her body required fuel regardless of what her mind thought about the situation. The scallops tasted expensive in ways she couldn't articulate, luxury flavors that felt obscene, when her life existed in suspended animation between threat and protection. "Why am I really here?" Maya asked, setting down her fork with deliberate care. "This isn't just about updating me on FBI involvement. You could have sent that information through Sarah or the security team. So what do you actually want from this dinner?" Dante's smile appeared briefly before disappearing into the control he maintained like armor against the world's casual cruelty. "I want you to understand that the protection I'm providing isn't a temporary solution until the threat passes. The Kozlov family doesn't forgive interference in their operations. Even if federal pressure forces them to pause their pursuit, the grudge remains. Which means your safety requires longer-term planning than simply waiting for them to lose interest." The words settled over Maya like snow accumulating on branches, each sentence adding weight until the full structure became clear and impossibly heavy. "You're saying this is permanent, that I can never go back to my normal life because the threat never fully resolves." "I'm saying that normal has to be redefined," Dante replied, his voice carrying gentleness that felt more dangerous than his usual bluntness. "You can't go back to your Pilsen apartment, or to working at Colette, or to living the life you had before Friday night. But you can build a different life, one where you finish your degree, where you develop a career using your considerable talents, where you survive and eventually thrive despite the disruption." Maya's laugh emerged sharp and bitter, cutting through the restaurant's ambient music like broken glass. "A different life under your protection. Meaning a life where I'm always obligated to you, always aware that my survival depends on your continued willingness to provide security. How is that different from being owned?" Dante's expression darkened, emotion breaking through the control he maintained with such careful precision. "It's different because I'm not asking you to work for me, to compromise your ethics, to become complicit in activities you find morally objectionable. I'm offering protection that allows you to pursue whatever future you choose, with the understanding that some geographic limitations and security precautions will remain necessary for your safety." He leaned forward, his intensity making the space between them feel charged with electricity that had nowhere to ground itself. "You think I want this? You think I enjoy knowing that saving my life has destroyed yours? I've spent 3 days trying to find solutions that return you to normalcy. And every scenario ends with you dead within weeks because the Kozlov family doesn't forgive and I can't protect you if you refuse protection." The raw honesty in his voice stripped away the performance both of them had been maintaining, revealing beneath it the complicated truth that neither wanted to acknowledge, that her warning had created bond between them that transcended simple debt, that his protection came from genuine care rather than purely tactical necessity, that somewhere in the space between saved and savior, they'd become people who mattered to each other in ways that complicated everything. "I don't want to matter to you," Maya whispered. "Too late," Dante replied. "You do." The second course arrived, interrupting the moment with plates of pasta that steamed in the restaurant's ambient lighting. They ate in silence that felt thick with unspoken implications, both of them processing truths that had emerged without invitation or preparation. Maya's mind raced through scenarios and consequences, trying to map futures that included survival, without including the kind of dependence that felt like losing herself entirely. "What if I refuse?" she asked finally, the question emerging from desperation rather than actual consideration of refusal as a viable option. "What if I just go back to my apartment, resume my normal life, and take my chances with the Kozlov family?" Dante set down his fork with careful precision, his movements controlled despite the emotion evident in his expression. "Then you die within a month, maybe sooner if they're particularly efficient, and I attend your funeral knowing I could have prevented your death if you'd been willing to accept help. Is that the outcome you prefer?" The bluntness should have felt cruel, but instead it felt like the first honest thing anyone had said to her since Friday night's bombing. Maya appreciated the lack of sugarcoating, the refusal to pretend that her choices existed outside consequence, the acknowledgement that some decisions came down to survival versus principle, and survival had to win if she wanted to live long enough to regret the compromise. "No," she admitted quietly, the single syllable acknowledging what they both knew, that she would accept protection because the alternative was unacceptable, that autonomy was luxury, afforded only to people whose lives hadn't intersected with violence that operated beyond law enforcement's ability to contain. "I don't want to die. I want to live. Even if living means accepting help, I wish I didn't need it." Relief crossed Dante's features briefly before disappearing into his usual control, suggesting her agreement mattered more than tactical considerations alone could explain. "Then we work together to redefine what your life looks like. You finish your degree remotely. You develop relationships with my security team so they understand your patterns and can protect you without feeling like constant surveillance. You learn about my world so you recognize threats before they reach you." He paused, seeming to consider his next words carefully before speaking them into existence. "And eventually, when you're ready, you decide what career path makes sense given your unique position and considerable talents. Criminal justice degree combined with practical experience navigating organized crime creates opportunities most graduates never access. Opportunities where you could do genuine good while remaining protected from threats that never fully disappear." The implication hung between them that Maya could work for him eventually, could use her education in service of his organization, could become the kind of strategic advisor Sarah had mentioned during her visit. The idea should have repulsed her, should have felt like betrayal of every principle that had driven her toward criminal justice studies. But beneath the instinctive rejection lived recognition that morality existed in gradients rather than absolutes, that sometimes survival required compromising principles in service of living long enough to uphold them in situations where she possessed actual choice. "I need time," Maya said, the request feeling simultaneously reasonable and absurd, given that time was luxury she might not possess. "I need to process everything that's happened, everything that's changing, everything I'm losing and potentially gaining. I can't make decisions about my future when I barely understand my present." "Take whatever time you need," Dante agreed, surprising her with his patience. "The protection remains regardless of whether you ever decide to work with my organization. Your survival isn't conditional on your cooperation. It's simply something I'm committed to ensuring because you saved my life, and because letting you die would make me the kind of monster I've spent 20 years trying not to become." The dinner continued through additional courses. Neither of them seemed particularly interested in eating, their conversation shifting toward safer topics. Her classes, his legitimate business interests, shared observations about Chicago's endless capacity to surprise residents who thought they understood the city. By the time dessert arrived, something had shifted between them, tension easing into something that felt almost like friendship despite the impossibility of such relationship between witness and organized crime figure, between protected and protector, between woman and man whose lives had collided through violence and were now bound by debt that transcended simple transaction. The drive back to the penthouse felt shorter than the drive out had been. Maya's mind quieter now that some decisions had been made and others postponed until her capacity for processing returned. The security guard in the lobby nodded as she passed, his acknowledgement feeling less invasive now that she'd begun accepting that surveillance was price of survival rather than violation of autonomy. The apartment felt less foreign when she entered, the luxury beginning to normalize in ways that probably said concerning things about human capacity for adaptation. Maya moved through the space preparing for sleep she doubted would come easily, her mind still processing implications and possibilities, and the strange reality that she'd somehow become important to a man who controlled violence, as casually as most people controlled their television remote. Her phone buzzed with incoming text from Dante's number. "Thank you for dinner. For trusting me enough to accept protection even when it feels like losing yourself. You're not losing yourself, Maya. You're discovering strengths you didn't know you possessed. Sleep well." The use of her first name felt intimate in ways their previous interactions hadn't approached, suggesting that barriers between them were eroding whether she intended such erosion or not. Maya stared at the message for long minutes before crafting a response that felt honest without revealing too much. "Thank you for keeping me alive, even when I'm not gracious about it." His reply came immediately. "Grace isn't required. Survival is enough." The next weeks passed in a strange rhythm, days spent attending classes remotely and completing assignments that felt increasingly disconnected from her lived reality, evenings spent reading about organized crime while living under its protection, nights spent lying awake, wondering how long before her new normal stopped feeling like temporary suspension and started feeling like actual life. Sarah Chen became a regular presence, stopping by twice weekly to update Maya on legal developments and FBI interests that remained intense but hadn't yet produced charges against anyone involved in the bombing. Detective Ramirez had apparently shifted focus toward building a broader RICO case against Dante's organization, her obsession with connecting dots, creating patterns that Sarah insisted didn't exist in forms that would survive judicial scrutiny. The security team rotated through shifts with practiced efficiency, their presence becoming familiar enough that Maya learned their names and preferences. Marcus, who brought excellent coffee each morning, Jennifer, who shared Maya's appreciation for true crime podcasts, David, who'd apparently saved Dante's life twice during ZNA previous assassination attempts, and wore the distinction like other people wore college degrees. March arrived with weather that couldn't decide between winter and spring, Chicago cycling through snow and sun with the kind of meteorological chaos that made planning outdoor activities feel like gambling against nature's mood swings. Maya had adapted to penthouse living with the same resilience that had carried her through her father's death and her mother's subsequent depression and the endless financial precariousness that had defined her life before Friday. Night's bombing had transformed everything. DePaul confirmed that her grades remained excellent despite remote attendance, her professors apparently either unaware or unconcerned about the circumstances that had forced her withdrawal from campus life. She would graduate on schedule in May with the criminal justice degree she'd worked so hard to earn, though the career paths that had seemed obvious before now felt complicated by practical experience that textbooks couldn't adequately prepare her to navigate. The call came on a Wednesday evening in mid-March, Marcus appearing at her door with an expression that suggested news requiring immediate attention. "Mr. Marconi needs to see you. Tonight. There's been a development with the Kozlov family." Maya's stomach dropped with velocity of freefall, understanding crystallizing that the suspended threat had apparently resumed motion toward collision she'd been hoping would never arrive. "What kind of development?" "What kind of development?" "The kind that's better discussed in person," Marcus replied, his professional courtesy failing to mask the concern evident in his expression. "The car's waiting downstairs, Mr. Marconi asked me to assure you that you're not in immediate danger, but decisions need to be made tonight that can't wait for normal schedules." She grabbed her coat and followed Marcus to the elevator, her mind racing through scenarios that would require an emergency meeting. After weeks of relative quiet, the drive took them to the River North building where she'd first accepted Dante's protection, the space apparently serving as his headquarters for meetings requiring privacy that even secure phone lines couldn't guarantee. Dante waited in the same room where they'd had dinner, though tonight the table held maps and documents rather than wine and food. He looked exhausted in ways she'd never seen before, the control he maintained so carefully showing cracks that revealed the pressure he operated under constantly. Sarah Chen was there too, along with 3 men Maya didn't recognize but whose presence suggested strategic importance, requiring their inclusion in whatever discussion was about to happen. "Thank you for coming," Dante said, gesturing to Maya toward the empty chair beside his position at the table's head. "I'm sorry for the late notice, but circumstances have forced acceleration of timelines I'd hoped to avoid for at least another month." He activated a screen mounted on the wall, displaying surveillance photos of men whose faces Maya didn't recognize, but whose expressions suggested they were accustomed to violence as a professional tool rather than emotional release. "These are Kozlov's senior lieutenants. The FBI arrested 2 of them this morning on federal racketeering charges, which means the organization is destabilized, which means they're more dangerous now than they were when operating under normal hierarchy." Sarah leaned forward, her intensity matching Dante's. "Destabilized organizations make desperate decisions. They're likely to escalate their pursuit of you as both revenge and distraction from internal chaos. The FBI's investigation has created a window where Kozlov's people are vulnerable, but that vulnerability makes them more likely to take risks they'd normally avoid." One of the unknown men, older, with gray hair and eyes that had seen enough violence to remain undisturbed by additional exposure, spoke with an accent that suggested Eastern European origin. "We have intelligence suggesting they're planning to move against Miss Reeves within the next 72 hours. The arrest of their leadership has created pressure to demonstrate strength, and eliminating the witness who started the FBI investigation serves both practical and symbolic purposes." Maya's hands trembled despite her effort to maintain composure. The reality that abstract threat was crystallizing into immediate danger, making her chest tighten with fear. She'd been managing to suppress through weeks of relative quiet. "So what do we do?" "I can't just hide in the penthouse forever." "No, you can't," Dante agreed. "You're leaving Chicago tonight. Montana remote property, completely secure. You stay there until this resolves. I have 8 weeks until graduation. Finals, papers, or you die in Chicago," Dante interrupted. "Choose." The use of her first name softened the ultimatum without changing its comment. Essential truth. Maya looked around the table at faces that held varying degrees of concern and calculation, understanding that the people in this room had been planning her evacuation while she'd been attending virtual classes and pretending that her life could somehow return to normal if she just waited long enough. "How long?" she asked, the question encompassing more than just the duration of her Montana exile. "How long before I can come back? How long before my life belongs to me again, instead of being negotiated by other people?" Dante's expression shifted into something that might have been grief, or simply acceptance of realities he couldn't change through force of will alone. "I don't know. Months, possibly longer. But alive in Montana is better than being dead in Chicago. And eventually, when the threat resolves, you return to whatever future you've decided to build." Sarah placed a folder on the table in front of Maya, documents visible through the transparent cover. "Everything you need is in here. New identity, banking access, contact information for security personnel who'll be stationed nearby. You'll have internet and phone access for completing coursework remotely. DePaul has already been notified that you're withdrawing from campus. For medical reasons, they've approved completion of all degree requirements through remote submission." The efficiency with which her life had been disassembled and repackaged for transport to Montana should have angered her, should have felt like violation of the autonomy she'd been trying to protect. But beneath the instinctive resistance lived recognition that the people in this room were trying to keep her alive, that their plans came from genuine concern rather than desire to control her, that sometimes survival required accepting help, even when help looked like losing everything she'd worked to build. "When do I leave?" Maya asked quietly, the question acknowledging acceptance, even though part of her wanted to refuse, wanted to insist on staying and facing the threat instead of running from it. 4 hours, Marcus replied from his position near the door. "Private flight from Midway, arriving in Montana before sunrise. The property has been prepared. Security is already in place. Everything is ready for you to simply arrive and settle in." 4 hours. Maya's mind reeled, trying to process that her entire life was being relocated with less planning time than most people devoted to weekend trips. But organizations like Dante's operated on different timelines than normal people, their resources and efficiency allowing them to execute plans that would take others weeks to coordinate. "I need to pack," she said, though she already knew that someone had probably already packed for her. that her belongings from the penthouse were likely already in transit to whatever remote Montana property would become her new prison disguised as protection. Already handled, Dante confirmed, surprising. Exactly no one. Your books, your laptop, clothes appropriate for Montana weather, everything you'd need for extended stay. You won't lack for comfort, even if you'll lack for company. He stood, moving around the table to where Maya sat, frozen with the understanding that her life was changing again, that the temporary suspension in the penthouse was ending and new chapter was beginning whether she felt ready or not. Dante crouched beside her chair, his eyes level with hers, close enough that she could see the exhaustion he hid behind control, could sense the weight he carried in trying to protect her while managing his organization's response to FBI pressure and Kozlov destabilization. "I'm sorry," he said quietly, his voice pitched low enough that only she could hear despite the room full of people. "I'm sorry that saving my life has cost you so much. I'm sorry that your courage is being punished instead of celebrated. I'm sorry that I can't give you back the life you had before you wrote that warning. But I'm not sorry that you're alive. Whatever this costs, whatever you lose, at least you're alive to resent me for it." The honesty in his voice broke something in Maya's chest. Emotion flooding through barriers she'd been maintaining, to protect herself from acknowledging how much she'd begun to care about the man whose life she'd saved. "I don't resent you," she admitted, surprising herself with the truth. "I resent the situation. I resent the Kozlov family and the FBI, and the circumstances that made writing that warning necessary. But you've kept me alive when dying would have been easier. I can't resent that even when I want to." Dante's hand found hers, his grip warm and solid and surprisingly gentle for someone capable of ordering violence with the same casual authority most people used for ordering coffee. "Montana is temporary. The Kozlov situation will resolve through prosecution or through other means that don't require your participation. And when it does, you return to Chicago or you go somewhere else or you do whatever you need to build the life you deserve. But you survive first. Everything else comes after survival." The flight to Montana passed in blur of exhaustion and adrenaline. Maya's body confused about whether she should be sleeping or preparing for threat, her mind cataloging details of the private plane, while simultaneously trying to process that she was leaving Chicago with no clear timeline for return. Marcus accompanied her along with Jennifer, the two security guards maintaining professional distance while making clear through their presence that she wasn't traveling alone, even when isolation felt like her new permanent condition. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. They landed in Kalispell just as dawn was breaking over mountains that looked like something from postcards rather than real geography Maya would actually inhabit. Another SUV waited, this one equipped for mountain roads and weather that could shift from sunny to blizzard with the kind of meteorological chaos that made Chicago's weather look predictable by comparison. The drive took 90 minutes, winding through terrain that grew progressively more remote, until civilization felt like a concept rather than reality. The property sat in a valley, surrounded by peaks, still snow-capped despite March's arrival. Accessible only through private road that required codes and clearance, and probably biometric verification, if security was as comprehensive as everything else. Dante's organization managed. The house itself looked like a luxury cabin rather than an actual residence, all glass and exposed timber and views that stretched for miles without encountering another human structure. Solar panels and satellite dishes suggested off-grid capability that would function, regardless of whether public utilities decided to cooperate. Inside, the space had been furnished with the same attention to quality that characterized the penthouse, though here the aesthetic skewed toward mountain modern rather than urban contemporary. "This is where you stay?" Maya asked Marcus as he showed her through rooms that seemed impossibly large for one person. "No, we stay in the guest house about a quarter-mile down the road," he replied, gesturing vaguely toward mountains that all looked identical to Maya's untrained eye. "Close enough to respond to any threat, far enough that you have privacy. There's a panic button in every room, satellite phone in case cellular service fails. Enough supplies to last 6 months if necessary, though. We're restocked weekly regardless." He showed her the security system's cameras covering every approach, motion sensors in the surrounding forest, drone capability for aerial surveillance if threats were detected approaching the property. The level of paranoia should have felt excessive, should have made Maya question whether the threat was as serious as Dante claimed. But the memory of the explosion at Colette, the sound of Table 14's pedestal base shattering under blast force, made every security measure feel justified rather than paranoid. Jennifer appeared with bags of groceries, stocking the kitchen with the kind of quality ingredients Maya had only encountered when working at Colette. Luxury food that suggested even isolation would be comfortable. "We're here if you need anything," she said, her voice carrying the warmth of someone who genuinely cared about the person she'd been assigned to protect. "Don't hesitate to call, day or night. Boredom is better than danger. But we'll help with both if you need us." They left as the sun fully cleared the mountain peaks, light flooding the valley with the kind of pristine brightness that existed only in places far from cities and their ambient pollution. Maya stood at the window watching the SUV disappear down the private road, understanding fully for the first time that she was truly alone in ways she'd never experienced before, isolated in luxury that felt more like exile than protection. Her laptop connected to satellite internet with surprising speed, allowing her to log into DePaul's systems and check the status of assignments that suddenly felt impossibly distant from her current reality. 8 weeks until graduation. 8 weeks of isolation in Montana, while Dante's organization and the FBI both worked to resolve threats she'd never asked to face. 8 weeks of surviving so she could eventually return to life that would never quite be the same as it had been before she'd written 3 sentences on a napkin, while a bomber worked beneath a table and death counted down toward detonation. Days in Montana developed a rhythm coursework, hiking, updates from Marcus and Jennifer. 2 more of Kozlov's lieutenants had been arrested. 1 had disappeared entirely. "Mr. Marconi asks about you," Jennifer mentioned during one visit, her tone suggesting the inquiry was more than just tactical concern. "I want to know if you have everything you need, if you're adjusting okay, if Montana is tolerable or completely unbearable." "It's tolerable," Maya replied, the understatement somehow feeling more honest than an elaborate explanation would have been. "Lonely, but safe." Which was the whole point, I guess. She'd been in Montana 3 weeks when the satellite phone rang at 2 in the morning, the sound jarring her from sleep with the kind of adrenaline spike that suggested her body understood that middle-of-night calls never brought good news. The screen showed Dante's number, the identifier making her heart race for reasons that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with the complicated feelings she'd been trying to suppress through isolation. "Maya." His voice sounded rough, exhausted, carrying weight that suggested he was calling from a situation that had stripped away his usual control. "I need you to listen carefully. The Kozlov family located your Montana property. We don't know how someone talked or surveillance was better than we anticipated or they got lucky, but they know where you are, and they're moving assets into position. You need to evacuate now." The words felt like the floor dropping away. Understanding, crystallizing that the isolation she'd begun to accept as a new normal had been penetrated. That safety was an illusion, and threats had been circling closer while she'd been reading textbooks and watching sunsets, and pretending that exile could protect her indefinitely. "Where do I go?" she asked, already moving toward the panic button Marcus had shown her during the first day's orientation, her body operating on autopilot, while her mind tried to process that she was about to become refugee again. That survival required constant motion, instead of the temporary stability Montana had provided. "Marcus and Jennifer are already en route to extract you. There's a helicopter landing in the valley in 8 minutes. Pack nothing, just go to the clearing north of the house and wait for pickup. They'll take you to a secondary location while we deal with the immediate threat." Dante's voice carried something beyond just tactical instruction. Fear maybe, or anger, or simply exhaustion with trying to protect someone whose continued survival required resources that were apparently insufficient against determined enemies with better intelligence than anyone had anticipated. "I'm sorry, Maya. I thought Montana would be safe. I thought we had more time." "It's not your fault," she said, the words emerging without conscious decision, driven by recognition that Dante had been trying to protect her despite impossibly complicated circumstances, that his resources and planning hadn't been inadequate so much as the threat had been more sophisticated than anyone could have predicted. "Thank you for the warning, for keeping me alive long enough to have this conversation. Stay alive 8 more minutes, Dante replied, his voice rough with emotion that broke through professional distance. "Get to that clearing and get on that helicopter. Everything else we'll figure out after." The line went dead. Maya ran through the house grabbing nothing because Dante had said pack nothing, trusting instructions even when instinct screamed to collect belongings and documentation and some evidence that her life had substance beyond moment-to-moment survival. The cold hit her face like punishment when she exited, March in Montana apparently feeling winter's grip more strongly than Chicago ever had. Or maybe fear made everything feel colder. The clearing appeared in darkness that seemed absolute. No ambient light from cities or even other houses, just stars and mountains. and the sound of approaching helicopters that became visible as lights rather than machine, distance, and darkness creating the illusion of floating illumination before reality revealed the aircraft's actual form. Marcus pulled her aboard with hands that gripped too tightly. His professional courtesy dissolved into genuine fear that suggested the threat wasn't abstract concern, but immediate danger that required evacuation with seconds rather than minutes of buffer. The helicopter lifted with stomach-dropping acceleration, banking hard to clear peaks that looked impossibly close in darkness, that made depth perception feel like guessing rather than actual visual information processing. Through the window, Maya saw lights approaching the house from multiple directions, vehicles converging with coordination that suggested military precision rather than amateur surveillance. Kozlov's people weren't just looking, they were executing an operation that probably would have succeeded if Dante's intelligence network hadn't provided warning time measured in minutes rather than hours. "Where are we going?" Maya shouted over the engine noise, Marcus's face barely visible in the cabin's red-lit interior designed to preserve night vision while allowing basic navigation. "Canada," Marcus shouted back, the answer surprising until Maya remembered that the border was probably close enough that helicopter travel could cross international boundaries faster than ground pursuit could follow. "Secure location near Calgary. The Kozlov family doesn't operate there. Wrong territories, wrong connections. You'll be safe while we figure out next steps." The flight lasted 90 minutes that felt like hours. Maya's body rigid with adrenaline that had nowhere to discharge, her mind cataloging the ways her life kept fragmenting into smaller pieces of normalcy that could be relocated when threats materialized. The landing pad sat atop a building in Calgary's business district, the urban location surprising after Montana's rural isolation, but apparently security through visibility was a strategy. When rural security had failed, the Calgary apartment was smaller, more functional. Windows overlooked the skyline. "How long this time?" she asked Marcus as he checked security systems and verified that the space was secure before leaving her alone again with isolation that had become her constant companion. "Unknown," he admitted, his honesty appreciated despite the answer being what she'd feared. "Mr. Marconi is working on a permanent solution. Something that doesn't require you to keep running, that actually resolves the threat instead of just delaying it. But permanent solutions take time, and time is luxury when Kozlov's people are hunting you actively. Instead of just maintaining a grudge they might eventually forget." He left her with satellite phone and security protocols and emergency contacts that had become her new normal. Dawn arrived over Calgary with the kind of gray light that suggested spring was considering its arrival without fully committing. The city below, beginning its Monday morning routines, while Maya tried to figure out how to attend remote classes while processing that she'd just been evacuated from her evacuation location. That safety was apparently impossible for her to achieve regardless of how many resources Dante deployed in her protection. Her phone buzzed, not the burner but her actual phone that somehow still functioned despite international roaming probably costing a fortune. DePaul's automated system reminding her that finals were approaching, that graduation was 5 weeks away, that she needed to complete outstanding assignments if she wanted to graduate on schedule. The message felt like communication from alternate universe, where normal academic concerns still existed, where students worried about exams rather than assassination attempts, where graduation meant celebrating achievement rather than surviving long enough to receive diploma that might never actually matter if threats kept escalating. She called Dante's number without thinking, without planning what she'd say, driven by need to hear his voice and confirm that he was still invested in keeping her alive, even when alive kept requiring new strategies and locations, and constant adaptation to threats that multiplied faster than protection could. "Compensate. Maya." His voice carried exhaustion that matched what she felt, recognition that they were both operating beyond normal human capacity to process danger and disruption. "Are you settled in Calgary? Is everything acceptable?" "It's fine," she said, the word inadequate but encompassing everything she couldn't articulate about luxury apartments and security protocols and isolation that had become defining characteristic of her existence. "Marcus said you're working on permanent solution. What does that mean? How do we permanently solve the problem of the Kozlov family wanting me dead?" Silence stretched across the line, Dante considering his answer, or deciding how much truth to share, or simply gathering strength to explain realities she probably didn't want to hear. Permanent solution means removing the threat permanently, which means either Kozlov leadership accepts negotiated peace that includes your immunity, or Kozlov leadership stops existing in forms capable of pursuing vendettas. Those are the options. Everything else is just delayed consequences. The implication was clear that permanent solution meant violence, meant death. Meant Dante's organization going to war with Kozlov's in conflict that would kill people on both sides and potentially destroy whatever uneasy balance maintained Chicago's organized crime landscape. "I don't want people to die because of me," Maya said quietly, the truth feeling important even when truth was luxury neither of them could afford. "I don't want you to start a war to protect me. The war started when they bombed Colette," Dante replied, his voice carrying certainty that suggested he'd already accepted the conflict that Maya still wanted to believe could be avoided. "Your warning prevented casualties on that particular day, but the underlying conflict was always going to erupt eventually. This just accelerated timelines and made the stakes more personal than they would have been if the dispute remained purely territorial." He exhaled, the sound carrying weight that suggested he'd been holding his breath while deciding how much to reveal. "I care about you, Maya, more than I should, more than is tactically advisable. More than I know how to stop caring even when caring creates vulnerabilities my enemies can exploit. So yes, I'm going to remove the threat permanently. Because you deserve to live your life without constant fear. Because you saved me, and I'm returning that favor regardless of what it costs. Because some debts transcend tactical calculation and become personal in ways that make war inevitable rather than optional." The admission landed between them like explosion, destroying whatever illusions Maya had maintained about their relationship being purely protective rather than personal, about Dante's investment being strategic rather than emotional, about her own feelings being gratitude rather than something more complicated that she'd been trying to suppress through isolation and denial. "I care about you too," she admitted, the words feeling dangerous but necessary. Honesty the only currency that mattered when everything else had been stripped away by circumstances neither of them controlled. "I don't know when it happened or how it happened, but somewhere between the Napkin warning and Montana evacuation, and now Calgary exile, you stopped being the mafia boss whose life I saved, and started being the person I think about when I'm trying to fall asleep in apartments that aren't mine in cities I never chose to visit." Silence again, heavier this time. Weighted with implications that neither of them probably wanted to examine too closely while survival remained. Uncertain and futures couldn't be planned beyond immediate tactical concerns. "When this is over," Dante said finally, his voice carrying something that might have been hope or simply determination. "When Kozlov is no longer threat, and you can return to whatever version of normal you decide to build, we'll figure out what these feelings mean. Whether they're real or just trauma bonding. Whether they can survive outside the crisis that created them. But first, you survive. Everything else comes after. Everything else comes after." Maya repeated, the phrase becoming promise, rather than just statement of priorities. The next 3 weeks passed in suspended animation, Maya completing finals remotely while Dante's organization executed plans she wasn't privy to beyond occasional updates from Marcus that suggested Chicago's criminal underground was experiencing the kind of upheaval that hadn't occurred in decades. FBI arrests had decimated Kozlov's leadership structure. Remaining lieutenants were apparently negotiating with Dante's organization about terms that would end hostilities without everyone ending up dead or imprisoned. The breakthrough came on a Tuesday morning in late April, when Sarah Chen called Maya's satellite phone with news that felt too good to be real. "It's over. Kozlov's remaining leadership has agreed to terms that include your immunity. You're no longer a target. You can come home." Maya stared at Calgary's skyline while processing words that should have brought relief, but instead brought confusion about where home actually was anymore. "What were the terms?" she asked, needing to understand what had been negotiated on her behalf. What price had been paid for her survival. "I can't discuss specifics," Sarah replied, her lawyerly caution asserting itself. "But the agreement is binding and will be enforced by parties who have interest in maintaining peace. You're safe, Miss Reeves. Actually safe. Not just protected for now, safe. The threat has been permanently resolved." The call ended with logistics about returning to Chicago, about reclaiming whatever fragments of her previous life still existed after 7 weeks of exile and evacuation, and constant motion away from threats that had finally stopped multiplying. But Maya didn't immediately begin packing or making travel arrangements or celebrating the end of crisis that had consumed her life since February. Instead, she called Dante's number, wading through rings that felt interminable before his voice emerged, carrying exhaustion and relief in equal measures. "You heard." "I heard," Sarah called. "She said it's over, that I can come home." Maya paused, considering her next words carefully. "But I don't know where home is anymore. The apartment in Pilsen doesn't exist. The penthouse was always temporary. Calgary is just another evacuation location. So where exactly am I coming home to?" That depends, Dante replied, his voice carrying gentleness that still surprised her, despite weeks of recognizing that his protection came from genuine care rather than purely tactical concern. On whether home means place or person, on whether you want to rebuild your life independently, or whether you're willing to let me be part of whatever you're rebuilding. The question hung between them, weighted with implications that Maya had been avoiding examining too closely while survival remained uncertain. But now, with threats resolved and futures actually possible to consider beyond immediate tactical concerns, she had to decide what she actually wanted, rather than just accepting what circumstances forced upon her. "I want to graduate first," she said finally, the answer feeling both insufficient and exactly right. "I want to walk across that stage in 3 weeks and receive the degree I worked so hard for. And then I want to figure out what comes next. With your help, if you're offering it. As partner, rather than protector. As person I choose rather than person. Circumstances forced me to depend on. Partner," Dante repeated, the word carrying weight that suggested he understood exactly what Maya was proposing. Relationship that transcended debt and protection, that acknowledged their feelings as real rather than just trauma response, that built futures together rather than maintaining the distance that purely professional arrangements required. "I can work with partner, though I reserve the right to occasionally protect you anyway, because caring about someone doesn't stop just because they don't need constant security details anymore." Maya laughed, the sound surprising her with its genuine warmth, discovering that she could still feel joy despite everything that had happened. "I can work with occasional protection, as long as it comes with occasional pizza and regular conversations, and the understanding that my career decisions are mine to make, even if they're informed by your considerable knowledge about how criminal justice systems actually function." "Deal," Dante agreed, his voice warming in ways that suggested smiling, that suggested relief matching what Maya felt at finally naming what had been growing between them since the night she'd written warning on Napkin, and changed both their lives irrevocably. Graduation day arrived with the kind of perfect May weather that made Chicago feel like the most beautiful city in America. Lake Michigan, sparkling under sun that had finally committed to spring after winter's extended grip. Maya stood in line with other criminal justice majors, wearing the cap and gown that transformed them all into identical figures despite their vastly different experiences earning the degrees they were about to receive. Dante sat in the audience, visible from where Maya waited for her name to be called. His presence somehow both conspicuous and perfectly ordinary among other families celebrating their graduates' achievements. Sarah Chen sat beside him, probably the only person in. To attendants whose law degree had been earned while representing organized crime figures, though her presence felt appropriate given how much she'd done to ensure Maya survived to reach this moment. Maya Reeves, Bachelor of Science in Criminal Justice, magna cum laude, the announcer called, her name echoing across the outdoor venue, where DePaul conducted its ceremonies. Maya walked across the stage, accepting diploma that represented 3 years of night classes and double shifts and determination that almost hadn't been enough to overcome circumstances that had tried repeatedly to derail her progress. The audience applauded politely, unaware that the young woman receiving her degree had prevented a bombing and survived assassination attempts, and spent 7 weeks in exile, learning that survival sometimes required accepting help from people whose morality existed in gray spaces that academic settings pretended didn't exist. She found Dante afterward in the crowd of families and graduates, his smile genuine in ways she'd rarely seen during their early interactions, when he'd been customer and she'd been server, and their relationship had existed within clear boundaries that no longer applied. He pulled her into embrace that felt natural despite the audience and the context and the fact that months ago she would have been terrified to touch him. "Congratulations," he said quietly against her hair, his arms warm and solid, and surprisingly gentle for someone whose reputation was built on violence he mostly managed through others. "You did it. Despite everything, you finished what you started." "We did it," Maya corrected, stepping back but maintaining contact through their joined hands. "I wouldn't have survived to graduate if you hadn't protected me. If you hadn't cared enough to start wars and negotiate peace and rearrange your entire organization around keeping one witness alive." Sarah approached with her usual efficiency, though her expression held warmth that suggested she'd become invested in Maya's survival as more than just legal obligation. "So, now that you've graduated, what's next?" Most criminal justice students pursue law enforcement or legal careers, but I suspect your options might be broader than the average graduate's. Maya looked at Dante, then at Sarah, then at the diploma she held that represented years of work and months of survival and futures that felt impossibly open after months of existing in suspended animation. I think I want to work in victim advocacy, helping people who end up in situations like mine, witnesses who need protection but don't know how to access it, people caught between organized crime and law enforcement without clear allies in either camp. Someone needs to navigate that space, and I apparently have unique qualifications. Dante's expression shifted into something that might have been pride or simply recognition that Maya had found a path that honored both her education and her experience, that used what she'd learned during crisis without requiring her to compromise the ethics that had driven her toward criminal justice in the first place. There's a lot of need for that kind of work, he said carefully, his tone suggesting he'd help facilitate whatever Maya decided to pursue. A lot of people fall through cracks between systems that aren't designed to protect witnesses when protection requires resources beyond what government agencies can provide. If you want to build something, organization, program, whatever structure makes sense, I have resources and connections that could help. Victim advocacy funded by organized crime felt ironic, but crime created victims who needed advocates. Let me think about it, Maya said, the request buying time to process possibilities that felt simultaneously perfect and problematic. I want to make sure whatever I build is actually helpful, rather than just serving your organization's interests. No offense, none taken, Dante replied, his smile suggesting he'd expected exactly this response, that he understood Maya's need to maintain independence even while accepting his help. Take whatever time you need. The offer stands regardless of whether you accept immediately or eventually or never. You've earned the right to build whatever future makes sense to you. They walked through campus toward the parking area, Maya's mortarboard balanced on her head at an angle that probably looked ridiculous, but felt appropriate for someone who'd earned the right to wear it through circumstances that had tested her survival more thoroughly than any exam. Other graduates posed for photos with families, their futures spreading before them in ways that looked simpler than Maya's reality, but probably contained complications she couldn't see from outside their experiences. Dante's car waited where his driver had positioned it, black sedan that had become familiar through months of being transported between locations that kept her safe while keeping her isolated. But today the isolation felt different, chosen rather than forced, temporary rather than indefinite, part of life she was building rather than life being imposed upon her by circumstances beyond her control. Dinner tonight? Dante asked as the driver opened the door, his invitation carrying casualness that suggested date rather than tactical meeting, relationship rather than protection arrangement. To celebrate graduation and survival and whatever comes next? Dinner sounds perfect, Maya agreed, settling into leather seats that no longer felt like luxury she didn't deserve but simply like a comfortable space where she happened to be. Somewhere without bombs under tables, preferably. I've developed strong preferences about my dining experiences. Dante's laugh emerged genuine and unguarded, the sound transforming his face in ways that made him look younger than the control he usually maintained suggested. I think I can arrange that. Chicago has many excellent restaurants, where the biggest danger is overpriced wine rather than explosives. The car pulled into traffic, carrying them away from DePaul's campus toward futures that felt uncertain but possible, complicated but navigable, built on foundations of survival earned through crisis that had somehow transformed into connection neither of them had been looking for. When Maya had written 3 sentences on a napkin and changed both their lives irrevocably, the future stretched ahead uncertain but visible. Maya had survived, and survival had taught her things education alone never could. Dante's hand found hers across the seat. Sometimes survival was enough. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.